Hello, creepy creature kids! This is Aidan, and welcome to the creator commentary video for Scapula Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle from Scapula and the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. This is the second creator commentary video I've done after the Scapula 15th Anniversary Zine video. That one was a Patreon exclusive. This one, however, is free for everyone to watch and enjoy because monsters and villainy are just too good to not be shared. For those of you who wish to follow along the story in this video, there's a few ways you can do so. First of all is to pick up an actual copy of Scapula and the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. This is available on my website bookstore, and every bit of support helps a lot. If you don't want to spare the money on that, simply become a Patreon backer and you'll get a free digital PDF version which you can follow along with. Now maybe you're a longtime Scapula reader, maybe you just happened to pick up this book on my convention table, or you just stumbled across it somehow. Either way, I hope you'll enjoy. If you happen to be an artist yourself, I hope showing the creative process helps you out. If you have any questions for me, please comment below and I'll try to help you out as best as I can. When I first created the Scapula series, I had sort of the idea to play it like a crime melodrama, not necessarily realistic, but a little more grounded. I didn't want to have fantasy or sci-fi elements appear, and I didn't want to have superheroes or superpowers. The rationale behind all that was if everything was fantastic and out of the ordinary, then nothing was really fantastic and out of the ordinary. Bit by bit over the years, sci-fi and elements did start creeping into the stories, and in 2011, there was the first full-blown kaiju story with the giant robot behemoth monster being assembled by the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. For the 10th year anniversary, I just said, screw it, let's do a kaiju tale and let's do it bigger than ever before. We had one monster before that was just a robot. This time, let's have a whole horde of monsters taking on the entire city. Let's have aliens, interdimensional travel, bizarre transformations, completely crazy monsters crashing through. So much fun! Let's jump right in. Okay, let's begin. If you are reading the PDF Patreon version, go right ahead and open it up. The very first page you're going to see is the Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle cover. If you are reading this from the actual comic book, like a good reader, you'll know that this is a cover within a cover, which seems kind of odd, although it's sort of like a chapter divide between the first story in the book, which is a Horror in the Wax Museum. Yet another reason to buy the damn book. And let's begin. So first things first is this is a fake cover within. It's very much a retro style cover. If you're a Scapula reader, you know I've mentioned many times the influence of an artist named Steve Ditko. Ditko, of course, is legendary for being the co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, which is probably mostly what he's remembered for now. But he did a lot of other comics too, and a lot of different styles, a lot of different genres, and a lot of the artwork you're seeing here is calling back some of the giant monster comics that he did for Charlton, I believe, or Dell, or one of the smaller companies, I forget at the moment. This big drawing here of the behemoth, the robot Brontosaurus, for those of you not familiar with the series, is very much modeled after one of the covers he did for the Gorgo comics, and there's a lot of little effects in there that are cribbed pretty closely, but that's just how much of an influence he had on me. Look to the bottom left corner in that drawing of Zarbanok, a character we'll be meeting later, and that's very much taken from a cover of a Ditko compendium called Fantastic Giants, which collected some of the Gorgo and Konga comics, but it also had some other monster stories in there, and that drawing of Zarbanok down there is like totally swiped from one of Ditko's drawings. The woman with her butt sticking out, that's not really so much Ditko, unless if it was one of the Eric Stanton inked Ditko ones. Consult your nearest comics historian or total geek if you don't get that reference. But let's get to the comic itself. Alright, so here we go with page 1. But before we talk about page 1, let's talk about page 0. This is our very first deleted scene. Now that's the joy of being able to do the commentaries, and for those of Scapula readers who are looking for extra content, this is where we're going to have fun, because we're going to see a lot of the stuff that was cut out. And if you think the stuff that made it is stupid, the stuff that was cut out is phenomenally stupid. So here's page 0, which we're going to call it, and It was never inked because you can tell this pretty early on. I knew this was not going to work. We are out in the middle of a swamp, and there's just this big, giant robot octopus in the middle of the murky waters. You can also see there's alligators, pythons, and lawyers who are attempting to deliver subpoenas and cease and desists on behalf of a certain comic book company that they represent. If the setting doesn't look familiar, or if you're not really getting the parody, maybe this audio will make it a little more clear.
Deep within a bleak and dismal swamp, hidden beneath its murky waters, lies the headquarters of the most sinister villains of all time, a Legion of Doom.
Yeah, so pretty obviously, for those of you who like superheroes and stuff like that, you'll know immediately what this is a takeoff of. Now, those of you who watched the commentary that I did for the Scapula 15th anniversary zine will know that I went on a big tirade about the difference between parody and plagiarism, and that is, parody is taking an idea, putting a new spin on it for humorous purposes or to just for your own, a new creative insight that you may have on it, and plagiarism is just taking somebody's idea and trying to pass it off as your own. This did not really feel all that much like it was there was a new and clever way to approach the villains living in a big robot thing in the swamp thing, because it was just taking it. And even though, yes, there is a joke about the lawyers calling out copyright infringement, stuff like that, calling out that you're doing something wrong is not necessarily all that clever either. So I knew pretty early on this was not going to work, and I just didn't bother to follow it up. Plus, it doesn't really have any overall effect on the story. I think those bottom two panels are just some of the sinister monsters walking down a corridor to the meeting they're going to have, which is also pretty pointless. It just made more sense to cut straight to it. So let's pretend that never happened and get right back to the comic itself. Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle. That is a very lengthy title. It's inspired by a lot of kaiju movies have very long titles like that. I think that one is specifically a reference to, there's a Godzilla movie, which somebody can correct me, I'm going to forget it off the top of my head. Giant Monsters All Out Attack, something like that. But it's, those titles are really a mouthful, but they're also very fun. We begin right with a slideshow projection. Let's talk a little bit about the past first before we jump right into moving ahead with what's new in the scene. Obviously, the scene there, for those of you longtime readers will know that, I think I mentioned in the introduction, the first kaiju story in Scapula was the first Sinister Monster Doom Legion story, which is collected in Scapula Volume 2, Fear of the Failure, which should still be available while you're watching this, if not, whatever. The plot of that story was the Sinister Monster Doom Legion getting together for the first time, and their big plan was to assemble this killer robot brontosaurus to bring the city of San Francisco to its knees. Now, I did not want to call upon too much continuity, because one of the main goals with this book, with this comic here, was both as a new introduction to the characters for readers who had never heard of Scapula before, but at the same time it was also the 10th anniversary celebration, which means a lot of it had to be tailor-made to longtime readers to reward them. So we are calling upon a bit of the past here, although it's just the very, very basic version. There is no reference to Dark Evil Hell Deathman, the sock puppet. There's no reference to the women that Scapula, or rather Dark Evil Hell Deathman, was kidnapping on his behalf. There's a lot of parts of that story that were left out. We're just keeping the very, very basic version, which was Behemoth was on a rampage and the sinister monsters were behind it. Getting to the new stuff, we have Scapula in his brand new outfit. Scapula has upgraded his costume a bit in this big trench coat ensemble with the belt buckles around the forearms and stuff like that. I'm not really sure why I went with a brand new costume for him. I think it was just to spruce him up a bit, although with a story like this, which has so much of the retro flavor of like old comic books and old monster movies, I probably could have left him in his old costume and it would have been a bit more appropriate than this new ensemble. The new ensemble here would be, it's a little more fitting in the follow-up book, Doubly Dark and Deadly, which is more about goth and industrial culture and stuff like that. But for this book, maybe I should have left it alone, maybe not. I guess it doesn't hurt it. It was basically just to show that you were getting a little bit of something new if you were a long-time Scapula reader, and just showing, things are moving forward. Jumping ahead to page 2. There's not a hell of a lot of a background here, because I think this background was still going back to the idea of them being in that big metal octopus, which obviously did not make the cut, so where they are now is a little more confusing. I probably could have just made this the Wax Museum lair. For the longest time operated out of a wax museum, and he had the Sinister monster staying there for a while during the webcomic run. For here, it just looks like a very generic background, which unfortunately happens a lot in my comics and a lot of other people's comics, is that you don't want to expand on the environment because it's more fun to draw the characters themselves. And I don't blame you, because, that's where the fun stuff is. Throgor asked the very obvious question, what's up with all the exposition? Because yeah, exposition, that's the other problem when you're recalling the past, is that you do need to waste a little bit of time talking about, what happened and why it's important. Scapula just skips a little bit ahead and mentions that they lost the damn thing, and we jump down to the next panel, which is a direct flashback of the scene, which is the behemoth collapsing through the Oakland Bay Bridge, which is what happened in that story. This is also an homage to the 1925 version of The Lost World, which is a classic dinosaur movie, which I love a lot, and I just decided to throw that in there too. Scapula also covers up the fact that he was the one at the behemoth's controls when that accident happened, which he's going to try to pretend it didn't happen, but whatever. And that's the end of the end of that part of the flashback there, the flashback that readers would know about. This next scene here, so yeah, big fat exposition dump, and honestly, if you're gonna have to pass along that much plot information, you might as well make it look visually interesting, which is why I put in this whole background of this the bottom of the ocean or the bay or whatever, and just pretty things to look at. During the old some of the Marvel monster comics of the 50s, it would just like randomly cut away to outer space just because it was visually interesting, although maybe it didn't have too much to do with the story at hand, and this kind of does a little bit. I'm looking at this again now, and this was some of the earliest use of changing the color of the inks to push things in the background to the foreground. The problem is it's not really working that well right here, because the inking in the background isn't that much different than the solid black on Scapula in the foreground. I think it's only at, if you're looking at an RGB scale, this would only be like a 25 on the blue scale, when it probably should have been much lighter. If I was doing this again now, I would have inked it with lighter blues, and I probably would have hit the blur tool in Photoshop to have fuzzed up a bit of the background even more, maybe pushed the whale further back so it doesn't look like it's the same size as the submarine. Atmospheric perspective is something I talk about a bit in another one of the videos for making the Scapula comics, which you can hit in the archives. Scapula mentions that, isn't it kind of strange that there was never any follow-up about the behemoth? Nobody ever found it, and he throws out his crackpot theory that the government went and took it away. Scapula is a huge paranoiac, as longtime readers definitely know. Only this time he's actually right. Where the robot ended up? It ended up in a panel with a huge weird mistake where that danger restricted area sign is not really fitted on the gate very well. I don't know why that is. That really should have been redrawn, and I don't know, that's a pretty big glaring F up, so yeah, don't let things like that slide. If there's any comic creators out there and you see something that bothers you, even if it just bothers you a little, do something about it now, because once it's in print and it's out there, you're stuck with it, and that's going to bother me. Jumping ahead to page 3, and Scapula just asks everybody if they have questions, and boom, 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 let's go bit by bit. This is just trying to give new readers an idea of who these characters are in the shortest way possible, just a quick reaction to their plan. And for longer Scapula readers, this was a chance to show off some of the new character designs that these guys had. Begin with one of the most popular characters in the Scapula comic, which is Hypnasia. Hypnasia here he's got a slightly new design, a little more frou-frou with the thing on the thing on the neck, the cuff. I don't know fashion, so I don't know what that's called. But you can also see he's now wearing clown white, which I guess was a way to make him just look a little less normal. I think he didn't really wear that much makeup before, but it's also fitting. We also know a bit from his dialogue here that, he goes to the kink pretty quickly, which was, I think, one of the things that made him pretty popular with readers back in the webcomic days. Hypnasia is definitely one of those folks who knows that Not only is he a very kinky guy himself, he also knows that he's surrounded by a bunch of dudes who are very much put off by that, and I think he gets a kick out of that. So, but that gives you the idea of the kind of person that he is. So, jumping next, we have Barbarous. Barbarous is now wearing a brand new leather mask, which is largely inspired by Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who was always an inspiration on Barbarous, but I just decided to take it a step further and put that kind of canvas mask on there, or canvas or leather or whatever it is. It's also a little bit of an homage to Eric Powell's The Goon, which had some characters who are also deformed characters who wore canvas masks to kind of hide that. We got the Toxic. Toxic looks largely the same as he did last time when we saw off. We'll see in a bit that he has some upgraded weaponry, and Toxic, being the voice of reason that he always was, just flat out simply asks, this is the dumbest plan you've ever had. Jumping ahead to Throgor. Throgor has had a pretty, not a humongous makeover, although it's in the spirit of, again, going back to the 15th anniversary zine, you guys will remember that when Throgor first appeared, he had a very, very kaiju dinosaur animal-like appearance where there's no way he could be a human being. And a lot of that was toned down when I did the webcomic, because again, going back to that rant I did earlier about not wanting too much of fantasy sci-fi elements on it, I wanted instead to present him more as an actual human, albeit one with an atavistic birth defect, a little bit like Killer Croc, I suppose. And eventually, those restraints I put on myself were in retrospect, were not really necessary. So for this story here, I just said, you know what, let's go back to making Throgor just a flat out monster, and just, have your cake and eat it too. If you want a monster character, give us a friggin' monster character. So even if a lot of the design elements are the same clothes, same kind of hair or whatnot, his features are definitely exaggerated a lot more, which they really always should have been. Jumping ahead to the next panel, here's Dr. Caliban, and Dr. Caliban was always a dick, and big surprise, he's still a dick. His new design here was meant to reflect on the retro sci-fi tone of the story, which this was sort of a dead end, because this design did not last very long with the bubble dome and the metal tentacles that he walks on. This is a callback to a machine that he had in an earlier webcomic story, and it also ties back to the fact that Dr. Caliban was always sort of a parody of Dr. Octopus. Bubble dome chair, which I assume he's just using because he's too lazy to walk around, it had like one more quick appearance after the story in Doubly Dark and Deadly, and then I got rid of it pretty quickly. We jump ahead to Tygodactyl. Tygodactyl had a huge redesign. In the webcomic series, Tygodactyl looked a bit more like an actual pterosaur man with a pair of purple pants, and I decided for this, that didn't make a hell of a lot of sense, because we had established pretty early on that he was just a guy in a suit, and I figured just for the sake of variety, rather than making him look like an actual human-animal hybrid, let's just play up the fact that he is wearing a suit, and it's a little bit more teched out. I guess it kind of works. And also, staying in the spirit of Tygodactyl, he very rarely speaks. That's something that was established a long time ago, is that not only is his grasp of English not all that great, Tygodactyl's from Japan, but he also just doesn't prefer to speak in English or in Japanese or any human language if he could prefer not to. He prefers to stay as a pterosaur. Are there any more bear claws? No. Ha 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 ha. So, we have 7 members on the team, and you guys who are reading the webcomics will know that this is the exact same roster that the team had when the webcomic ended. The lineup is all exactly the same. And I've gone back and forth over this about whether or not this should have been the time to expanded their numbers. This whole book is, it's called Scapula and the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. It should be about the Sinister Monster Doom Legion, and there should be an actual legion. As long as I was really indulging the huge monster aspect of the book, we should have just thrown in more monsters. Now, we'll be talking a little bit later about the 2 new members of the team who were added very, very late in the game. And yeah, this scene here is definitely an example of why that would have been really tricky, because we have 7 characters in one scene, and there's a lot that's going to be going on, and I can only imagine just how chaotic this would have been had there been 9 members or 13 members or who knows how many. So on the one hand, I would have liked a little more, and on the other hand, it probably would have ran the risk of it being just a humongous mess. So And speaking, yeah, humongous messes. Let's look at this panel down here where we have 7 characters speaking, and all of it is shoved into one, just one panel. And this is the beginning of the argument. Now, again, going back to Steve Ditko, I've mentioned so many times just how much Ditko's work on Spider-Man was just a colossal influence on me. If you go to my video archives, you'll see a video which is dedicated entirely to the influence The Amazing Spider-Man had. And at the root of so much of Scapula is a story that was in The Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, which was the first appearance of the Sinister Six. My favorite scene in that entire story is, of course, the only meeting the Sinister Six have is when they're preparing their big scheme against Spider-Man, and of course they can't get their crap together because everybody in that group will not play nice, and there's a lot of bad attitudes and a lot of egos, and you can very much see that almost taken verbatim in this scene right here. Throgger and Hypnasia definitely did not get along well throughout pretty much the entire damn series, and this is sort of going back to just the animosity the two of them had. And apparently somebody ate the last maple eclair. Nice tidbit you're gonna get for those of you reading it now. The person who ate the eclair, it was Scapula. You never would have known that had you not watched this commentary. Anyway, jumping to the next page. Babarus flicks a booger because gross out humor is something I'm not really hugely fond of, but every now and then it works. And of course, the #1 gross out character in the entire damn series was Babarus. And those of you who have known Toxic for a long time will know that that very deadpan, unflappable demeanor of his means that he wouldn't get riled up. I don't think all of these exclamation points in his dialogue would work because I don't think Toxic would get all that worked up about it. Never mind the fact that he's wearing a hazmat suit and getting hit with a booger probably shouldn't be a huge deal, but I'll live with it. Scapula, of course, calls out that whole trope of bad guys fighting each other thing because it's very, very common with most any supervillain team, with some exceptions, but it's just as true here as it would be with guys like the Masters of Evil. And we get into a big chaotic panel down here. So, a very big influence on Scapula since nearly the beginning was Mad, and I mean the original Mad from EC Comics with artists like Jack Davis, Bill Elder, John Severin, and especially Wallace Wood were huge influences on me. They are some of the best cartooning work you'll ever see in comic books or otherwise is in the EC Mad. And this is meant to be one of those very chaotic panels that you would see in someone like Bill Elder, who had that chicken fat design, that style, which is just cramming as much as possible into one page. I actually think this panel is very tame compared to some of the other chaotic fight scenes that had come before and since. Those of you guys who have Scapula, the greatest freak show of all, will know that there is a huge chaos panel with the sinister monsters fighting a crowd, which I think is probably the best example of that I ever did. And compared to that, this looks very, very basic. And actually, this is an example, even though I had just complained earlier on about not wanting too many characters in a certain scene, this one actually would have been better with as many characters as possible just crammed in there and just making it a total barrage of villains beating the hell out of each other. Down here we have Scapula quietly reacting to it. Mission begins in 10 minutes, I'll be in the car. That's not really the funniest line ever, but it leads to a visual you could put in your head of imagining if all these guys had been crammed in a car to go on a road trip, which would have been pretty damn funny. I think that would have been better to have included here than just that random punchline, so we'll call that a missed opportunity. Area 51, 25 miles away from San Francisco. The whole point of that is just showing how the sinister monsters get from San Francisco, which is where the series has always taken place, out to Area 51. The real Area 51, of course, is in New Jersey, but for the sake of this story, we have to make believe that it's somehow a little closer to San Francisco, because otherwise you'd be wondering what did they do in the entire time they went there and the entire time they go back. We have a couple of guards here. Know something, Wally? What's that, Woody? Very obviously a callback to Wallace Wood, who I had just mentioned. Definitely look him up. He was an incredibly talented, very troubled, amazing artist, whether or not it was like action or sci-fi or especially his humor stuff. Again, going back to Mad, it's definitely worth a look, so keep the man's memory alive. Colorful smoke comes in and glitters, and stepping in front of the camera is a pretty cheesecakey shot, which seems appropriate. Of course, it's actually Hypnasia. During the webcomic, every now and then when a new reader would come in through the webcomic, they would mistake Hypnasia for a woman, and I never corrected them on that because it just feels appropriate. Only Hypnasia was never quite as much of a woman as he is here. And of course, this is demonstrating Hypnasia's hypnosis abilities, which were very rarely seen. I think I mentioned earlier that superpowers were something that I had never really wanted to play up too much during the webcomic and the early stories, but here I just decided to give him a little boost and show that, that through his chemical skills and his drug skills and all that too, he could actually conjure up some pretty good illusions. He's no Mysterio, but he does well enough with the team. We have this lineup here showing Hypnasia's pretty cute as a girl, which is more than you can say for Scapula, who looks almost like a female Disney villain, a little Maleficent-ish right there. Hypnasia, of course, is totally flattered that these guys are interested in him. Scapula, who is a total homophobe, is not interested, and Papyrus just looks as clueless as he would no matter what. Jump to the next panel, we can see a little bit of the goofy expressions on Wally and Woody, and this is the last time they'll ever appear again, so we'll wave goodbye to them and just get back to Scapula, who's going to take the story forward. Team Tyrant to Team Weasel, I don't know why I use those terms, but it seems appropriate that Scapula would identify his section as the Tyrant section, and the other faction we'll be seeing on the next page would be the Weasels. Jumping ahead, so here's our control room. Throgor has burrowed his section of the group into there, knocked out a lot of guards. Probably could have taken that a little further. Toxic calls Dr. Caliban Oliver. This is a very old joke in the series that Dr. Caliban never liked being called by his actual name, which was Oliver. Doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense if you're a new reader reading this, but it's just a really quick little callback, which is little character touch, again, going back to the relationship that these characters had with each other for 10 years. And of course, Dr. Caliban, being Dr. Caliban, responds in a very mature manner. Don't call me Oliver, fartface! We jump to the next panel here, and this bothers me a lot. Now, you remember when I was telling you guys about a few pages ago that if there's little mistakes, don't just live with them, because once they're in print forever. The screens that Dr. Caliban is pointing to are some of the sloppiest, sketchiest schematics, and no, they're not saying anything important. It's just, it's just tech crap. It's showing that this is, you use your imagination to decide the importance of these things, but what it's actually saying is not really all that important. But it still looks very half-assed and very lazy, and I really wish I'd put a little more work into that. For some reason, when I was drawing it, I did not think it would print all that larger clearly, and then of course when you do have it in print and it's much bigger, then you notice a lot of those mistakes that you thought were going to be completely unseen, and of course there they are, bright as daylight and pretty damn big in a magazine-sized comic book. And we have this big gigantic cluttered warehouse, which, a nitpick from me, does not look cluttered enough. This really should have been filled to the brim with boxes and crates and crap. There also should have been, there are Easter eggs here, going back to classic sci-fi, but there's not nearly enough of them for my like. You can see sort of the manta ray spaceship from War of the Worlds. Gort from Day the Earth Stood Still is down there. Next to him you can kind of see there's the midget alien from Invaders from Mars. And over there is a bit more, to the right-hand side, there's a bit more of a generic spaceship. Maybe it's a little bit like the Harryhausen one from Earth versus the Flying Saucers, but not really all that much. And again, this did take a long time to draw, but it should have been so much more. These boxes should have been some of them should have been reaching the ceiling to have made this joke work, because the joke is obviously there is so much crap here that if they're going to find anything, it's going to take them forever, and they don't have that time frame. So I guess that's another lesson for artists and cartoonists and whatnot. If you have an idea, just push it as far as you can go. You can always scale it back, because if you don't go far enough, you just get a halfway full warehouse when you could have had one that was just like exploding to the brim. Let's move to the next page. Hypnasia, with his usual wisdom and foresight, is sticking his hands into a container, which was very, very clearly marked as dangerous, but whatever. On the right-hand side, you can see there's a very generic gray alien, which fits the Area 51 atmosphere. This probably could have been a specific reference. I'm thinking there's a sort of a similar scene in the Joe Dante Looney Tunes movie where they have Area 52 in that movie, and it's inhabited by actual famous aliens from sci-fi movies, Robot Monster and the Metaluna Mutant and Daleks, stuff like that. This could have been something a little similar to that, but I guess I was afraid that it would be like stealing a joke, even if it's taking a joke that somebody else had took, which involved taking other characters and whatnot, but whatever. It's a gray alien, and that's the very first thing anybody thinks of when you think of Area 51. Let's move along, just like Scapula is in the background. What the hell is this? I actually like that expression in Scapula. Tigodactyl and Babarus aren't really framed very well right there, but obviously the focal point is Scapula himself. And we get to our big reveal of the behemoth and showing that this thing is just a shell of what it once was, or rather just a skeleton. This is the old design of the behemoth has gone for good, and we have now the skeleton version. A lot of this was inspired by, I'm obviously a big King Kong fan, and the stop motion models in that movie, like stop motion models in general, were not made to last. And there is a photo of the Brontosaurus model from that movie which had like really decayed over time, and I think I went back and referenced that a little bit here. It's not taken entirely, but it's supposed to have that same sad tone of like a desiccated monster just hanging from the rafters. Toxic is on the phone here, and speaking of pushing ideas further, this is visually very much the same as Toxic's appearance on the previous page, where he's just on the phone. I wish I had done something a little more with that. It would have been funny if at the previous page he had been just at the vending machine inside Area 51 just ordering something, and then just here the follow-up panel we see he's just eating it or just having a cup of coffee. Anything than just the exact same visual again. It's any little visual things to make things interesting, throw it in there, artists, because missed opportunities are just as frustrating as leaving mistakes inside there. Knock, 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 knock. A character design that I don't really care for. This character really bugs me. It's just supposed to be some douche who's inside, just some douchey scientist who's inside there, but I kind of wish I had gone with another look for him. Another very light chaos panel. This again, like that fight scene earlier, this probably could have been taken a little further. Could have had more scientists in the background freaking out or running away, but here it is now. Actually, my favorite reaction with the scientists in the background is just the dude with the Coke sitting at the computer, like barely reacting to it. That is... I do kind of like that. Scapula says now he wants pizza. Plot point. That's going to come up later. Nausea, it being in his usual semi-threatening, semi-flirtatious way, talks to Mr. Chinpile, which, let's just call him that. I don't think he ever has another name again. About where they can find the most expensive thing here that's worth stealing, since obviously the behemoth isn't going anywhere. And Mr. Chinpile tells them that the thing they're working on is this big, gigantic sci-fi, whatchamacallit, thingamadoody, the interdimensional telegateway porter. Scapula gets tough. Now, this was something we had not seen too much in the webcomic. Again, this was sort of a new approach to Scapula, to actually showing him as a competent villain, or mostly competent villain, but one who wasn't, freaking out and shrieking as much as he used to. So he's going with the threat, saying, "Don't lie to me or I'll know," which obviously he doesn't. He doesn't have mental powers or stuff like that, but that's just a very cheap intimidation tactic, which of course Mr. Chinpile is not falling for, because he's pretty wrapped up in his own work. Scapula reacts with a what is spelled W-U-T. That's an intentional thing. That's a alternate funny spelling of it, but it seems out of place here when he's trying to look tough. We'll be referencing that what again later on. Jumping next panel here, we have a very, very caricatured, disgusting face on Mr. Chinpile, but this is the kind of thing I was talking about earlier with that one scientist design that I hated, but this works much, much better, just because if you're gonna have a throwaway character here delivering more exposition, then you might as well make it as visually interesting as you can, and one of the things you can do with that is just go for broke with funny expressions. There's a lot of that EC drool cobwebs inside the mouth. That would have been something that I guess like Jack Common or Graham Ingalls or even Jack Davis would have done. And once again, going back to Ditko, We have all that stuff coming out of the Telegateway Porter, which is very, very much inspired by Ditko's backgrounds for like Doctor Strange and the like. Mr. Chinpile is explaining a bit more about a multiverse in there. I know multiverses have become extremely popular in movies since, but don't worry, we won't be doing that with this tale. Now we're going to take a peek through here. This is a look from the reverse side of the portal, and we see another bit of a comic homage. I've mentioned Ditko many times, but you can see around here, those big black chunky dots are what are commonly known as Kirby crackles, which is a reference to artist Jack Kirby, obviously. Jack Kirby I never really got into as much as Steve Ditko, not necessarily because he's bad. He was an amazing artist and probably the most influential superhero artist of all time. But I don't recall reading too much of his stuff when I was growing up. Maybe that would have been different if I had been given a copy of Fantastic Four instead of Spider-Man when I was a kid, but that's how it is. But it still works. So now we're introduced to the first of the interdimensional characters who we're going to see running wild in this comic, the Pleasurelians. And they're pretty one-note characters, but for the sake of this story, that works kind of fine. This is some weird little pseudo Lisa Frank inspired dimension they come from, but whatever, it's just supposed to look as open and appealing as possible. Speaking of open and appealing, here's our Pleasurelian queen, who I don't think is ever identified as such in the story itself, but whatever, you know that she's in charge because she's got the most fancy outfit to a very revealing degree. I think I remember at one comic book signing I did, some kid opened this thing up and basically pointed out to his parents, look! A lot of the Pleasurelians' designs, I'm looking at this now, and honestly, I think one of the things I would do differently now is I think the skin color probably should have been different, more alien. It probably could have worked better with green or blue, something like that. It also would have made us seem less raunchy, less adult material kind of thing than going with like, just a general Caucasian skin color. Probably should have gone yeah, that should have been a bit more fanciful. And why the hell not? Because these are our first alien characters that have ever shown up in the Scapula series, so this probably could have been a bit more fantastical. Now, I'm speaking after the fact about changes that I would like to make, but even while I was drawing this, there were a lot of changes made to this character. In fact, there was like an entire inked and colored pass of this Pleasurelian queen looking very different. Now, some readers have pointed out for the longest time, why are there so many thick women in the Scapula series? You have a lot of more full-frame female characters like Gemini, Knuckle Sam, Dr. Zhirakov, Mooney Meadows, women like that. And it's, they're nice. I like that. Anyway, so I think I had a lot of that in mind the first time I drew this through, because as you can see in the before and after versions that are posted here in the video, she had a much, much slimmer appearance first, and then afterwards I looked at that and I just said, dude, why the hell not? This is my comic, and if I want to make her as thick as I like, let's just do it. Why the hell not? This is my comic. If you want to see super skinny to the point of anorexic characters in comics, you could just look at like any damn superhero series out there where the characters, especially the women, have like 0% body fat, and it's just like, no, if you want to do curves, just do curves. You can see some of the Pleasurelian soldiers in the background there. I'm going to talk a bit more about their designs later on when we get a clearer look at them. For here and now, it's mostly just the Pleasurelian queen. And this is where we introduce the very, very vague notion of pleasure. The very first way you can interpret that is the obvious way, which is the way that Scapula and the boys are going to be reacting to that. But as we're going to see later on in the comic, the idea of pleasure is a lot more vague than what you might be thinking right off the bat. But of course, Scapula and these guys thinking that, the most obvious kind of pleasure they're going to give them gives them an excuse to really want to pull them through and start messing around with things that man should leave alone, which is probably the earliest theme in science fiction, going all the way back to Frankenstein. But it doesn't take much to convince Mr. Chinpa that, yeah, what the hell, we got guys here who are capable of kicking my ass, and if their ultimate goal is to bring sexy women through another universe, why not? Everybody wins. They decide to pleasure you now. There's a very dumb exchange between them. Working it now. Gross, the gateway jerk. Yeah, you guys get that. We jump to the next panel. This is kind of weird here. This is This is like a static, and we hear like, static white noise coming through. The screen is scrambled up, and technologically, that's a very, very far throwback. Now, I don't know how old everybody who's watching this video may be, but I am old enough to remember black and white TVs with UHF knobs and antenna and things like that, which would like garble the picture, which is what I'm going for here. I don't think if you like anybody who doesn't remember the 20th century is going to be pretty lost on that, but whatever. I guess it looks like what it's supposed to, and Scapula even calls it out. Yeah, is there a UHF knob on this thing? Somebody is hijacking the signal, and who it is? It's the next panel, the big reveal. Oh, there we go. Ah! Extreme close-ups are just very, very funny to me when they happen in movies, even in movies that like use extreme close-ups to like supposedly dramatic effects. For some reason, getting very close to the camera just cracks me up. So having our menacing face just like shoved right up in there just makes me laugh. Speaking of funny faces, we go to the next panel. This is one of our return to stupid-looking Scapula faces. For some reason, he's got like chin and jowls there, even though he really shouldn't, but it just makes for a funny drawing. But of course not as stupid as Mr. Chin Pile there, the last we're going to see of him, and that is a very kind of mad gag right there with the false teeth like flying out of the mouth as he gets strangled. If you look closely at Mr. Chin Pile's skull, you can see that he does not have any teeth in there. That's something I almost did not think of until like the last minute, but I know that would have been kind of weird if the skull had teeth, even though he spit out his teeth earlier. And so we are introduced to the next of the interdimensional characters and our main antagonist of the story, Zarbanok. Now, first things first, that dialogue, "Beware, cowards," is very obviously a reference to Sinister, the old arcade game, which I probably could have called upon even more. Run, 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 coward! The very basis for Zarbanok's look, which is the octopus-headed alien thing, is of course going back to Lovecraft, going back to Cthulhu, Cthulhu, whatever you want to call him. As you can see here, let's take a look at like the earliest character designs of him were, touched upon the very basics of Cthulhu, which is the octopus head and the dragon wings. I left out the big belly. Pretty early on, I knew that wasn't going to work because Cthulhu is an awesome design, as has been seen by so many people who swipe from him, including myself, because longtime Scapula readers will remember there was a Cthulhu parody already called Kahuku, and that was the main reason why I knew I couldn't just go with yet another one here, because it was just drawing too much from a well I had drawn from before, and who knows, readers would have even gotten confused or waited for like a connection between those two versions of Cthulhu parodies. So I chopped that out pretty quickly on. The replacement for the wings were these liquid tentacles, which I guess you could say is maybe a little callback to Venom or any other blob kind of monsters like that. And they just sort of awkwardly come out of those shoulder blades where the wings were supposed to be, but there's no real logic to it. From this angle, they just look like they're coming from behind, but as we'll see later on, they're just sort of emanating from it without much reason to that design. A lot of this design here for Zarbanok I really feel does not work, and again, that goes to the overall tone of the story. I had complained earlier about how Scapula's sort of industrial trenchcoat look doesn't really match the retro sci-fi look that the story was going for, but that's really, really true here of Zarbanok, where a lot of his design looks just much too modern. But if I was going to design Zarbanok now, it would look a lot differently, so for the sake of this video, I actually did take another crack at his design. Let's look at it here, and as you can see, it is much, much more in tone with the comic, where it looks a lot more like a retro alien. A lot of which this new design homages is a character named Emperor Guillotine from an old series called Johnny Socko and his Giant Robot, which is better, his flying robot, which is better known as Giant Robo in the series that followed afterwards. But it's, super flashy, but it also addresses what the needs of the character are, which is like this fake royalty, this very dignified looking character, as we're going to find out more about Zarbanok in the story ahead. And it's got a lot of that retro flair, and it still does keep a lot of that Lovecraft inspired phobia of seafood in there too. So if I could do it all again, this is the way I would do it. Agree with me or disagree with me if you like, but It's just another perspective for a character who, I wish I could do differently now, but what's done is done, and we are now stuck with Zarbonok. For better or worse, but probably for the worse. So, as these guys are about to find out, let's jump to the next page. They stumble in there and greet our cyborg mollusk demon thing. His name isn't just Zarbonok, he is Zarbonok Poo-Poo. Poo-Poo! Yes. I feel inclined now to read an essay that I wrote when this was first published on the Scapula webcomic page. Is Poo-Poo funny? An essay by A. Casserly. Is Poo-Poo funny? Well, that all depends. If we're talking about actual fecal matter, the answer is no. There's nothing funny about seeing it, smelling it, touching it, etc., as anyone who has a pet or a baby will tell you. Despite what many gross-out comedies of the late 90s, early 2000s repeated endlessly, actual dung is not amusing in the slightest. But why is the word itself funny? I think it's because we're hardwired into some of our earliest memories. Parents seem far more concerned with whether or not a child is behaving well more than anything else, and one of the biggest taboos of child behavior was dirty talk. Even if you were acting like a little angel and even mentioning something that mom or dad found unpleasant would get you into trouble. This was your earliest experience with authority, but oddly enough, you soon learned the innate thrill of challenging authority. Letting words slip that you knew would irritate a parent, guardian, teacher, or uptight babysitter was riding the razor's edge between freedom and a timeout, or a smack in the head. And your inner child still remembers that thrill, that fun, dare I say, that rebellion. Yes, folks, every challenger of societal norms, especially comedians, begins with poo-poo. So it's nothing about actual fecal matter and dung like that, because it's crap like that, quite literal crap like that. This is just a cheap gag, which hopefully maybe got a laugh out of somebody, and maybe you could just say I did this for any kids who happen to be reading this, kids who weren't going, oh! Whatever, I never claimed to be able to come up with brilliant bon mots and just like clever playwright screenwriting, what like that. If I think of a poo-poo joke and it's going in there, it's going in there. Scapula's reaction, of course, is just like everyone else's. What? Now, you see, this is the time to have used that what from earlier, the one that was intentionally misspelled as W-U-T. I wish I could switch around those two whats. Too late now, but whatever. Fool Human, which is, of course, an homage to Robot Monster, which is one of my favorite classic sci-fi movies ever. And he repeats again, I am Zarbonok Poo-Poo. Now, the joke is pretty obvious that poo-poo in his language does not mean what it means in our language, despite the fact that he's speaking English and he seems to, with every other word, seems to mean exactly the same thing as it does here. Poo-poo, it does not. Now, for those of you who do find stupid stuff like this funny, you're in the same company as Throgor and Dr. Caliban, who are beginning to get the giggles. Poo-poo. Yeah, poo-poo. Our high and mighty Zarbonok, of course, is upset that you scoff at my royal lineage. Now, aside from the poo-poo dialogue, a lot of Zarbonok's, the tone of it was very much inspired by Dr. Doom, and Dr. Doom is, of course, a great character, especially as one of the consistent things with Dr. Doom, no matter who is writing him, is just that very regal, elegant way he speaks of himself, including talking in the third person, and I think a lot of that is what inspired Zarbonok.
Tremble before the uncontrollable poo-poo!
Their reaction here is hopefully what somebody's reaction out there. I hope somebody got a laugh out of it. This very exaggerated throwing your head back was a semi-running gag in the Scapula comics. There were a couple of times where if a character got beaten to death and you didn't want it to be like, if it was supposed to be like a comical death, not a serious death, not a bone china death. If this was supposed to be some douchebag character who just got the beating stuff out of him for humor's sake, sometimes it would be followed up by a panel of the persons who did it just like cracking up and pointing at them and laughing. This is sort of a throwback to that, although there hasn't been any beating yet. And Zarbonok already hates his planet, and for good reason. Now we jump to our next page. Scapula here is, putting an end to this long-running poo joke, which is just going to go on a little bit longer, as poo-poos tend to do. We have to establish who Zarbonok is, what he wants, and what he's going to do with the story. And thankfully it's pretty easy to set up the trope of the invading alien, because that's such an old trope anyway, so it doesn't take too much more to establish that. I was mentioning earlier that Zarbonuk's design doesn't really work. I will say that one of the things that does work here is just I'm glad that there is a bit of a size difference here just to make Zarbonuk look imposing. We've made a lot of jokes about Zarbonuk so far, but he does also have to be a credible threat because, you know, there's a time and a place for a pathetic antagonist, but there are times where you really want to treat the threat of the story as a meaningful threat. He tosses him to the ground there. We get another silly face from Scapula, which I still like doing those there, even if this is supposed to be capable villain Scapula. This is still a comedy at heart, and just getting to do stupid stuff like that was funny. Your offer's acceptable, showing that, you know, Zarbonuk's on board, and now he's going to take his turn at the rest of the characters. And we jump ahead to our next page. This is the reveal of that Zarbonuk has some shape-shifting abilities, or something along, not like a full shapeshifter, like a Skrull or whatnot, but that his body is capable of augmenting and rebuilding itself, as he shows when he produces out of his hands something called a transmutron, that, you know, it transforms people. So, you know, that's pretty straightforward. Don't need to explain how it works. It just does. If an alien pulls out a gun and says it's going to do something fantastic, I don't think anybody's going to question it too much. And it's got all these needles sticking out of it. The needles don't actually do anything here other than just making it seem like this is going to be extremely painful, which, of course, our crew immediately thinks that's what it's going to be, judging by the reaction in the next panel. Is this going to hurt? Yes. Oh, goody. I like that. That's one of the few dialogue exchanges in this comic that I actually really like. And he opens fire on them, and there's a pretty fun visual here, coming up with the skeletons of some of these characters. Now, a lot of them have pretty normal human skeletons, but there are some exceptions, such as Barbarous, Throgor, and, you know, showing that they're a bit more deformed. This is another reason why I'd mentioned earlier why I would have liked to have included some new members of the team, because getting to see, like, the skeleton of Gog Magog would have been pretty interesting, too. They collapse from the blast, and we get some dialogue here from Scapula that I'm not really all that crazy about anymore. Hey, you killed him. Do you know how many hours online it's going to take to find new lackeys? That bothers me for two reasons. Number one, it is way too similar to a joke from a movie called Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which is an Edgar Wright movie. I'm a big fan of Edgar Wright's films, the Cornetto trilogy especially. In Scott Pilgrim, there's a joke that's towards the end of the movie where the big bad guy has mentioned that he had put together a team of villains that were disposed of pretty quickly. And he says something like, "Do you know how long it took me to assemble that team? 2 hours," or it's something along those lines. And this feels very similar to that, where it's not just a cheap gag, it's a cheap gag that's more or less swiped. But the real reason why it bothers me is that it's a bit out of character. By 10 years in of working with these guys, Scapula has developed a relation with them. He wouldn't actually say that. It would be a long, long time before Scapula learned to appreciate his crew. But for here and now, I don't think he would say something like this, how just treating the Sinister monsters like they were disposable or they were easily replaced. You could make the argument that he's sort of downplaying any attachment or friendship he has to them to sort of impress Zarbonuk, or to make like he's trying to make Zarbonuk think, oh, I can just get new lackeys whenever. But that's a bit of a stretch. I think Scapula would definitely be a little more loyal to his crew. Now, there had been times in the past when he did throw his crew under the bus. We remember the incident at Burning Man and other times like that. But after everything they've gone through by this point, especially after the Memento Mori storyline, I think a lot of the relationship had changed and been made stronger. They still fight, of course, as we had seen in the beginning of the story, but I think their loyalties were a bit stronger. And a line like that really downplays a lot of it, so I don't think it's a deal breaker, so to speak, with this character, but at the same time, I don't really think it works too well. That's not a problem, though, because as Zarbonuk reveals, they're not dead at all. They're fine. In fact, they're going to be getting better than fine. We see the transformation begin in the next panel here. There's some very fun expressions. The transformation expressions are fun. I kind of wish I had done more with them. In fact, I kind of wish the previous panel probably could have been squashed a little more, and this panel could have been expanded to have shown more of the characters transforming. We get our ominous shadow cast on the wall. It's an old trope, but it works. Scapula is watching the transformation as Zarbonuk ominously says, "This plebeian is only the beginning." That's the end of Act 1. We'll be right back after the music break.
Yes, I can. that's what I do. That's right. I'm a werewolf, a walker when the full moon comes. A werewolf, a walking all night long. A werewolf, a walker when the full moon comes. A werewolf, a walking all night long. I'll take your werewolf through the park. I'll make sure they don't bite or bark. We'll run and play the night away. Home before the break of day. I'm a werewolf, a walker when the full moon comes. A werewolf, a walking all night long. A werewolf, a walker when the full moon comes. A werewolf, a walking.
And we're back. Coffee's topped up. Kaiju are ready to roar. Let's move on to Act 2. Less exposition, more demolition. Okay, so we're starting off here with our establishing shot of San Francisco. It's always a good idea to show what the city looked like before it gets trashed. And we move on down to the busy streets. So crowd scenes can be very rough to draw, obviously, because it's, a lot going on, a lot of different people. But I sort of made a promise to myself at the beginning of the series that if I had to draw crowd scenes, I would make them look at least as interesting as possible, either by peppering them with familiar faces, or by just, adding new funny faces to the crowd, which we have a bit going on here. So in the first panel, this is the first boom, boom, boom coming down, and there are 3 faces that look familiar. On the far left, wearing all black, is Baron Story. Those of you who have watched my videos, the one about making zines, will know that I talked a lot about Baron there. Baron is a fine artist and probably the best teacher that I ever had. So I've tried to stick him in the background of Scapula comics here and there. He's in the very first, the original zine, so it's kind of nice to include him again here. In that video, when I'm talking about zines and talking about Baron, I'm also with my friend Ashley, and if you look at the character dead in the center with the hoodie, you'll notice there's, not only is it Ashley, Scapula readers know that's a character named Little Miss Miserable, who's sort of a parody of Ashley, who I've been using for a long, long time now. So, hi Ashley, you're in the comic. And on the furthest right is Mooney Meadows, the stoner, hippie, nudist, pothead chick who Scapula dated for a while and she drove him crazy. The next panel is more familiar faces, but they're not familiar faces from the Scapula series. These are familiar faces from famous monster movies, particularly giant monster movies. On the furthest left is Akihiro Hirata as Dr. Serizawa. I'm sorry to say that's not the greatest likeness of him. Once again, this is a case where I drew something thinking that it was going to reproduce very small, so I didn't go into a ton of detail for it, and the end result is it printed larger than I thought, and you end up with a likeness that doesn't look anything like him. Next to him is Robert Armstrong as Carl Denham from the original King Kong, still the best Kong ever. Next to him is a very bad drawing, I'm sorry to say, of Fay Wray as Ann Darrow, again from King Kong. Awesome movie, but you guys all know that. Next to her is Raymond Burr as Steve Martin from the Americanization of the very first Godzilla movie, Godzilla King of the Monsters. And the couple on the furthest right, and probably the only ones who are drawn kind of decently, are Kumi Mitsuno as Miss Namikawa and Nick Adams as Astronaut Glenn from Monster Zero, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, or its official name by Toho, Invasion of Astro Monster. And your IQ drops 10 points every time you say that title. Come on, Toho. But Toho has influenced us a lot with their kaiju movies, so let's go right into a kaiju attack. So, our great big splash panel, our great big reveal. The very first kaiju shown here is Throgor. His kaiju form was designed like almost immediately. Very little was done because, let's face it, Throgor was like 90% kaiju anyway, and this is just a matter of just beefing him up just a little bit. It's really playing up the dinosaur-mammal hybrid that he always was, which is always a very cool combo. If you're looking for like a famous kaiju inspirations, I'd say Gomez from Ultra Q, a bit of Baragon, Gorgo is another one, and just bits and pieces of various forms of Godzilla. There's a lot of animal influence with him too, but that was always the case of Throgor, so this is really just playing up the bestial aspects of him. There's a lot of influence from lions, gorillas, bears, rhinoceri, crocodiles, and various species of dinosaur. Those of you who have the book will know that immediately after the giant attack monsters story, there's the 2-page spread, which is called the Monsters After Party. The reason I bring this up is because this 2-page spread ended up affecting the layout. Now, this Giant Attack Monsters was already finished by the time I had done that. I got the idea to put that spread in the book, and unfortunately it threw the page count off because those 2 pages had to be side by side, and a new page had to be inserted even after the story was done. This is why if you read this story back during the webcomic run, this following page was missing. Now, one of 2 pages comes up as a result, and the first one is yet another deleted scene. The dialogue is missing here, so I'm going to walk you through the pencils. So Throgor has made this big reveal, and he's passing by a building. Inside the building is a very hyperactive, nerdy sort of fellow who doesn't have a name, but let's just call him Mr. Fart, which is, it'll make sense momentarily. Mr. Fart sees Throgor passing by, and he's like, "Oh no! A giant monster's gonna kill us all!" Ah! Upon realizing that, yeah, he's probably gonna die anyway, he's just like, whatever, so be it! He grabs a female co-worker, steals a kiss from her, then he goes up to his boss, punches him in the face, cusses him out. He turns around towards everybody, pulls down his pants, and rips a big fart, and probably cusses everyone out too. But, womp womp, in the next panel we see, Throgor is actually just past the building by, as some of the other people in the building point out, "Oh look, he just went by the other way, we're saved!" The aftermath of Mr. Fart's big outbreak is the company president comes down and says, "Well, what do you have to say for yourself?" At which point Mr. Fart pulls out a huge assault rifle and says, "No big deal, I was going to shoot up the office today anyway." Safety's on. Yeah, so once again, for those of you guys who watched the 15th anniversary zine video will remember the shame box. This was something I did for that video as a way to tally up all the offensive jokes I had done there. So far with this comic, we haven't been all that offensive, probably not in the least. It's been very PG, maybe a little PG-13, but this page in particular really touches upon a lot of taboo stuff that you can't do. Let's hit a tally for sexual assault, physical assault, scatological humor, the fart, and finally gun violence. All of those things, except for maybe the fart, would get you in a huge load of trouble if you did that. Now, yes, this is just a cartoon, this is just a comic, but at the same time, you never know who's going to be offended by stuff like that. So, Mr. Fart and this entire page went bye-bye, and the substitute page came in its place, which is continuing the attack. Now, I'm sorry to say the replacement page is not entirely without its faults either. So we start with another crowd scene with random folks, some guy ogling some woman, some random doomsday guy with a sign, and standing out of the crowd is a pretty familiar looking guy if you're familiar with the biggest dinosaur movie in the 1990s, who he points out, "Everyone freeze! His vision is based on movement!" I can't do a Sam Neill voice, so bear with me. This is followed up by a very familiar looking fellow who kind of looks a little like Richard Attenborough, Richard Attenborough, who asks, "How do you know that?" And at which point our Sam Neill looking character goes crazy and says, "'Cause the voices told me, blah, 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 blah." This is a joke that just does not work. Now, what I was going for is obviously this is a reference to Jurassic Park, and the vision based on movement is the big giveaway for that. This is sort of a nitpick I've always had about that movie where Dr. Grant knows things about dinosaurs that he would not be able to know based on fossils or whatnot. And specifically, he knows things that are part of plot points. He knows that the dinosaur's vision is based on movement, which is scientifically inaccurate, but we'll let that pass. But he also knows somehow exactly how velociraptors would attack people from the sides. He knows that from the bones. Now, maybe you could say, okay, he's a paleontologist, he's studying animal behavior, but even as a kid, I thought that was very strange that he would know these things just based on bones of a raptor, and velociraptors didn't live in North America anyway, nor did Dilophosaurus spit poison, but whatever! It was a fun movie. I've got nothing against Jurassic Park. And if you're saying I'm being a nitpicking dork, well, my punishment for that is a joke that makes no sense. I don't think anybody got this joke. I don't think it works. And you can just say it's member berries for the sake of member berries. I just say it's just an obtuse joke. So let's skip right past it and go right to the big scene of chaos. This was originally going to just be a full-page panel, and I wish to God I had done that. This would have been a nice moment to have revealed all the kaiju form of the Sinister monsters attacking. I think I didn't do that because I wanted to reveal them more or less one by one to keep the surprises going, but I'm looking at it now, and anything would have been better than that Jurassic Park joke that doesn't work. And we have yet another crowd scene. Heading the crowd scene is a familiar character, not just to longtime Scapula readers, but to longtime readers of my comics in general, namely my first webcomic, Dada Hyena. That woman is, of course, Christy McGough, who is very, very long-running character of mine, who not only was in Dada Hyena, but also crossed into Scapula. Christy, coincidentally enough, was in the 2011 Sinister Monster Doom Legion story that I had mentioned earlier. She is one of the women who was kidnapped, but she is also fast asleep throughout that story. I think that was the first time she crossed over into the Scapula series. And this was about a year before I really decided to make her actually really a part of Scapula continuity and not just random cameos. But that's getting ahead of myself. Here she is now, running. She has a bit more of an updated design than she did back in the webcomic days, showing that she's gotten a little older. And if you look on her shirt, there's a Baby Jane Narwhal, who was another character from Dada Hyena. Okay, but let's go on to our kaiju attack in earnest. This crowd scene is a little more sparse, because obviously we have something bigger to focus on, and here's the kaiju form of Toxic, who has become a humongous pollution monster. You could say he's taken inspirations from any number of blob monsters like the Blob, but I think the number one thing that it was probably the inspiration for him is Hedorah, the smog monster, another Toho creature. Namely, that's a pretty obvious one, the pollution reference. Somebody else pointed out that his face, or the trunk that kind of comes out of the gas mask, looks a little bit like Marvel's Man-Thing, which is fine with me. Man-Thing is awesome, and I'd imagine whatever Toxic touches burns, regardless of whether or not it's afraid. Moving along, we have our yet another crowd scene of weirdos. We have a huge kaiju hand coming in, lifting up a bus, and we see the reveal in the next panel that it's Babarus picking up the bus. Now, Babarus's kaiju form isn't really based on any kaiju in particular. You could say it's like, general anthropoid giant monsters like King Kong or the Cyclops or whatnot. It's mostly animal influences. You can see the snout and the tusks are like a lot of pig species, warthogs or babirusos or whatnot. The shape of the head is sort of like those orangutans that look like they've stuck their faces through a toilet seat cover. And the body is sort of ape-like, and a lot of the ridges are inspired by armadillos or pangolin. Flying above him is Tygodactyl. Now, one of the forms I had considered for Tygodactyl's kaiju form was a bit more of the tiger angle, where the body would have been tiger-like with wings coming out the back. If you imagine like a griffin, it would have been sort of like that. And the reason I didn't go with that was simply because I had to pay homage to one of my all-time favorite kaiju, and that is Rodan. Rodan was probably one of the first kaiju movies I ever saw. You gotta show your love sometimes, so some of the tiger aspects were kept intact with, you could see the back legs and the tail, but this is mostly a bit more of a standard pterosaur monster. Moving to the next page, the next two panels you can see there's a bit more of the attempts at atmospheric perspective, where I am coloring the lines of background elements a little differently. I still wish I had gone lighter, but it's an improvement at least. You can see Tygodactyl's inks are a little more reddish to fit in with the sky, whereas the foreground, Scapula and Zarbonok inside the spaceship are more of a darker blue to pop them out against the background. Look at all the carnage out there. It's the greatest horror show I've ever created. This is a big part of Scapula, which is the showman. That, of course, is more of something we'll be seeing in the finale that came years later with the greatest freak show of all. But we've known by now that Scapula likes putting on a good show, and even if the audience is dying, he really is doing it for their attention. And down below is another big chaotic panel with more of the monsters attacking. Big foreground foot. If you look at Babarus in the background climbing a building, I think that's a bit of an homage to the game Rampage. Now that I think about it, Rampage might have been my first exposure to kaiju, because I remember playing that arcade game when I was very, very young. And what's not to love about a game where you just climb buildings, punch things as a giant monster? So yeah, there's a little bit of an homage going on in there. And we move on to our cutaway scene. Now, B-plots are something I usually don't like including in my comics. For the most part, I prefer stories, even if they're not necessarily straightforward. There's a lot of twists and turns, but there's not a whole lot of times where I have two different plots going on. That did happen sometimes back in the webcomic, when the serial webcomic, when you had time and space to pursue other plots alongside your main one. But for a magazine-sized comic that's only like 50 pages long, time is precious, space is precious, and you basically can't afford to diverge too much. Now, Of course, the Pleasurelians are part of the story, and they're going to weave back into the main plot later on. This is just giving them a little time for some silliness to happen. We can finally see the full figure form of the Pleasurelian queen. I hope you enjoy, although God knows how that dress is supposed to fit on her or how you would actually move around in that thing. And we get a bit more of a look at the Pleasurelian soldiers, which I had mentioned earlier. Their design is mostly based on a sci-fi movie called Zeta 1. I don't remember too much about this film, but the most memorable thing about it are the aliens. And the aliens are all hot women wearing bikinis and wearing these Cleopatra wigs. I don't know what it is, but for some reason that hairstyle I really, really like. Quite a few characters in this comic have used it. Dr. Zhirakov and kind of sort of Bone China with a more raggedy Susie Sue version of the Cleopatra, I'd say, is her. The panel next to it, there's a slight mistake where you can see the soldiers. They all have this marking on this face that kind of looks like eyelashes or whatnot, but for some reason the one on the furthest right does not have them. I don't know how I would have overlooked something like that. They've come across something. It's on the other side of a fence, and they've finally come face to face with one of the beings of this mysterious dimension, and it's a dachshund. Dachshunds are freaking hilarious. I know people think pugs are comedy or they think corgis are comedy. I say wiener dogs are the funniest goddamn animals that have ever lived. And it's not just because their shape is strange, it's because anybody who's ever owned a dachshund will know that they have such a huge attitude for being such a small little animal that even if they're just these overstuffed weasels, they still think that they're Great Danes in their minds, and they will come up to anything and go, whoa, whoa, ah! Which is exactly what this one is doing. He doesn't care that these are aliens from another dimension. They could be next door neighbors. They could be the milkmen. Whatever they are, he's going to come up and scare them away with this mighty lion bark. To which the Pleasurelian queen replies, "Very well, prepare to give this earth creature pleasure." Now, when this comic was posting in the on the website and whatnot, I think it was like 2 pages a week building up to the Kickstarter campaign that I'd done for it. This page posted on its own without the other page immediately to follow it up, and a lot of the webcomic readers saw that last panel and commented below with dread in their hearts, "Oh my God, is she gonna do that dog?" Let's all be grateful that the webcomic readers' first guesses were wrong, because nobody wants to see that. And guess what? They're pleasuring the doggy in the way that anyone pleasures a doggy, with lots of attention, with playtime, with scratches and some treats. And pleasure is achieved, although there's a strange detail where, if you look at the panel below where the dachshund's asleep, that blue Pleasurelian seems to always have a lot of errors with her, not just missing the makeup, but here she's missing the inking on her rear. I guess for some reason I thought that was going to get cropped out, or that panelless background was going to edge up alongside of it, but for some reason it edged a little more and I just didn't finish inking her. That's a bizarre mistake, so let's move along and pretend it didn't happen. Scapula is looking for something that's going to please him, and it turns out it's pizza. Outside waiting a Zarbanok, he maybe could have had him smoking a cigarette, but I guess that doesn't matter. Scapula is coming out of there, showing off their extra greasy food. Because, hey, that's a good way to make friends with somebody pretty quickly, I guess, is to share some pizza with them. But, well, there's a flip side of that, as we're going to see later. Scapula and Zarbanak enjoy an impromptu din-din, and it turns out they're not the only ones who are eating, because on the next page we have a most horrifying feast going on as this gigantic tongue, it's a tongue, is coming down and lapping up a lot of, again, more bizarre people in a crowd, just because I have to make things interesting as best as I can. And we get the big reveal of the kaiju form of Hypnasia. Doesn't really recall too many kaiju I know of. The only kaiju I can think of that he sort of resembles is the Dada alien from Ultraman, which is a very fun design. And yeah, there's a little bit of that going on, sort of vaguely. I'm looking at him again now, and it's oddly enough, there seems to be sort of a yokai look to him. Those are really, really bizarre creatures. You got turtle frogs with buckets in their head. You got women with a face on the back of their heads, or with big snake necks coming out. You have giant snails that eat wieners. Those kind of wieners. And then you have fill flickers, and I'm not even gonna, you can figure out what the name from what a fill flicker is. But Some of them have a vaguely or extremely overt perverted tone to them, and I guess that's sort of what I'm going with here with that big slobbering tongue, because again, Hypnasia is a total pervert, and it only makes sense he would turn into a perverted monster, or as perverted of a monster as a PG-13 comic could get away with. I had wanted to include Hypnasia's nose in there. It could have been done like, I guess, like a Tengu or some of the other Oni with big long noses like that. It just didn't end up working with the design, although I guess sort of a compromise is, if you see in the next panel, from a profile, Hypnasia's head sort of forms a beak shape, so I guess that's sort of incorporating the nose there. Tall panel here, I should have done way more vertical panels because they're a nice way of showing size in space. There's not a hell of a... I would have liked to have put more stuff going on in the foreground, or helicopters, things like that. If you look very closely, Tygodactyl is attacking a helicopter, but it's so far away you could barely see it. I would have liked to include something in the foreground, maybe on top of the building. Could have been people watching it. Although if you do look in the windows of that building, you can see Dada Man, who was again, an old Dada Hyena character who crossed over into Scapula before and was kind of phased out of the series, but here he is again making a quick cameo. A nice up-close attack by Toxic. Again, yeah, that vertical panel format works really well. I should have done way more of that in this comic. In fact, I should have done way more of that in general. I can't really recall too many other times in the Scapula series where something like this occurred, but oh well, at least it got to be used once. Now then, we have another deleted page here, but this one is very different from the others. When I decided to do this giant monster commentary video and the sort of re-release for my Patreon backers and whatnot, I had toyed with the idea of maybe doing some new content, meaning adding in a new scene to the story. If you've seen the 15th anniversary video, you know that I did retouch that old comic a bit, especially for the 15th anniversary. The difference, though, was that for the 15th anniversary zine, it was about restoring stuff that had been taken out previously. It was restoring to the dialogue that had been before I censored it. It was reinserting a character that I had removed for no good reason and putting it back in. So it's not so much adding new stuff as it was bringing stuff that had originally been meant to there back into it. This was creating new content for a story that had already come out, and in the end, it just didn't... that felt a little too much like cheating. I am very much back and forth about whether or not it is okay to retouch your old work. Frank Frazetta did it, but on the other hand, George Lucas did it too, so it could go either way. But what the heck, for the sake of this video, I am going to show you guys a scene that I made specifically for this anniversary, and whether or not you think it belongs, you let me know. The dialogue is not included, but I'll walk you guys through it once again. The Plagerian Queen has shown up, and this time she's come across a little punky kid, just some kid in the street, and she tells him,
"What would be your pleasure? We're going to give you any sort of pleasure you want."
That's not what she would sound like. I just can't do her voice because I can't sound sexy. Well, I can't sound sexy like a woman. The kaiju attack is going on in the background. I probably should have said that. So we're in the city now. There's a crowd running away. The Plagerian Queen has just shown up and not really paid any heed to what's going on in the background because she's talking to this one kid that she came across and she's going to pleasure him. What would pleasure this kid? The kid says, "I want to see more monsters fighting." Now, earlier on, I had, been talking about mentally flip-flopping between having 7 monsters in the team or increasing their ranks specifically for this story. And I went ahead with just the original 7 of them because I didn't want to overload things. But as that story was finished and I was putting this book together, I had come up with designs for new characters that I wanted to add in. And the 2 new characters came up, and the very last thing that was added to this publication was a 2-page story called Comic Book Story. And this is where we belatedly got those 2 new characters. You can also see they're on the very back of the book, included in Scapula's hands with the other members of the team, just to show that, yes, these are new members of the Sinister Monster Doom Legion, even if, sadly, they were left out of the Giant Attack Monster story. On the left is a character named Kamongo. Kamongo has a fish theme to him, specifically Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is one of my all-time favorite monsters and monster movies. And next to him is Gogmagog. Gogmagog is sort of a Frankenstein kind of ogre without much of a brain, and he's got a small simian kind of midget sewn onto him. I guess visually it's a little bit like the Manster. Now, I would have really liked to have included these characters in the story. Again, going back to this publication, there is kind of sort of a kaiju form of them on that very last page in the super deformed kaiju attack, but I wasn't really happy with some of those designs, especially for Gog Magog. Years later, when I was doing just practice ZBrush models of these the kaiju form of these characters, I designed a kaiju form of Gog Magog that I ended up liking so much, which was sort of an elephantine kind of creature. For giant monster historians who knew Willis O'Brien, in a concept he had made called King Kong versus Frankenstein, will know that he had designed a giant form of the Frankenstein monster that was made out of like elephants and megafauna and things like that all sewn together, and that was a big influence on this. So this kaiju form of Gog Magog came about years later, and I liked it enough to the point where it's like, God damn it, I really wish he had been included, because it would have been so much fun. So I thought about retroactively putting him into that story as best as I could, but the way it happens is not especially graceful. So Kamongo and Gog Magog are sitting at the bus stop, presumably because they're going to the Sinister Monster Doom Legion in progress. I guess they were late. Why they're just suddenly here now? They're trying to catch up with them, but they're just in the right place in time for the Pleasureline Queen to see them and turn them into monsters. So she works her magic. We get the big reveal finally of their kaiju forms. There's the elephant Frankenstein Gog Magog I'd mentioned earlier, along with the kaiju form of Kamongo, who is more or less the same as he was in that super deformed sample from the comic, where it's like a sea serpent with tentacles. A little bit of this is inspired by an old movie called Jack the Giant Killer, which has a two-headed giant and an octopus tentacled sea serpent. So there they are, kind of crammed together here. There's the big reveal. But in the next panel below, the kid says, changed my mind. I'd rather have an ice cream cone. So the Pleasureline Queen obliges. She turns Gog Magog and Kamongo back into humans. Of course, they're at an altitude of kaiju, so... She shrugs her shoulder, and the little punky kid goes off with his ice cream cone. Does it work? No. Do I wish I could have put Gog Magog and Kamongo in the story? I do, but it's too late now. As for the kid and his ice cream cone, keep an eye on him, because that may come back into the story. Moving on, we have back to Throgor, back to a burning city scene, and of course back to the Godzilla influence. Those of you who remember the original Godzilla, or Gojira, Godzilla King of Monsters, whatnot, know that the attack on Tokyo has some pretty memorable shots of the city on fire, or mostly the city on fire from a distance, so you can light a background set on fire and have Godzilla a little more in the foreground. This is the first time in this story where atmospheric perspective seems to be working, because finally those background inks, especially on Throgor, are faded enough that he looks like he's quite a bit further away than our characters in the foreground. So, better late than never, but whatever, at least it's finally working, and I'm a little grateful for that. Nice work there, Pooh, and that is the final poo-poo reference in this entire story, because why is there no more poo-poo? Because the story is full of cheese. Speaking of cheese, there's pizza. Anyway, so he's gonna go have himself a piece of pizza, and boom, betrayal already. If you're like me and you came from a big family of overeaters, you knew that pizza was a precious commodity, so if pizza was there, you better grab yourself some soon. We go to the next page, and Zarbonaka's already gotten his mollusk mandibles all over it. Exquisite. Scapula probably says what everyone else has ever said, either vocally or mentally, when they see the last slice of pizza go, "Rat bastard son of a bitch! That last piece is mine!" And stealing the last piece of pizza is the ultimate dick move. He pulls out something that sort of looks like a garage door opener. I guess he could have activated that, however, but just mentally or whatnot, but whatever. A remote makes it very clear he's about to do something. Scapula takes the hit. Very mad, sort of inspired Daniel there. He starts to transform. That's some pretty grotesque imagery right there, but that's all meant for a contrast for the follow-up. And Scapula has transformed into a three-toed sloth. What will happen next? We've come to the end of Act 2. Let's go to the music break, and Act 3 is coming.
Diggy Chuck Berry, when the werewolves get hairy, let's all move a little hop and do the head
And now we come to Act 3. Killer giant monsters, a treacherous alien, and our hero is actually probably the Pleasurelian Queen, so let's see how she's doing. Pleasurelian Queen is once again somewhere else at random, talking to someone else at random about some sort of random pleasure she'd like to give. Now, this is a really, yet another bizarre character design that doesn't really harken back to anyone or anything in particular. I think in the thumbnail sketches, this was a stereotypical comic book nerd, but I decided not to go with that angle because we had a lot of, nerdy four-eyed geeks already in the Area 51 section, and I just thought, okay, that's just beating a dead horse. He sees this, very alluring, pleasure-giving lady in front of him, and his mind immediately goes to one thing. Getting rid of those damn monsters! Yes, our little twist here is just some random dude just decides to be altruistic and to use his one genie wish on getting rid of these annoying monsters who are causing a ruckus. This is a fun panel right here. I know I've been going on and on about atmospheric perspective and fading stuff out in the distance, but right here the monsters are a lot more colorful than they should be at that far away. But I'm totally fine with it in this case, just because it's kind of fun seeing the array of colors with them all together, and it's a very cartoony panel anyway. It doesn't need to be that realistic. And speaking of things that are not realistic, we're going to lose the backgrounds altogether and go with light, flashing colors as the Pleasurelian Queen summons pleasure power. Now, anime as a genre is very, very, very easy to lampoon. And I kind of feel like a poser using it here because I'm not really a huge anime connoisseur. I don't have anything against it. It's an art form and I'm not going to judge it or whatnot. It's just I never got into it as much as the tokusatsu genre. I feel fine, parodying stuff like Godzilla or Ultraman because I'm familiar with that material inside and out. And I kind of get the feeling a lot of people who do parody anime are only familiar with just like the very common tropes or whatnot, big eyes and flashing lights in the background, which is pretty much all you're getting here. A lot of crazy poses coming from the women here. These were fun to draw, actually. Helpful advice to any artist. Figure draw. Get lots and lots of figure drawing in because it comes in handy and you can do a lot of funny things with it, even if those funny things consist of shooting lasers out of your armpits or your upper thigh. It's coming out of her upper thigh. And our kaiju are suddenly under attack. Throgor takes the hit, Toxic takes the hit, and perched on top of that building at long last is the big reveal of our missing member, Dr. Caliban, who has anticlimactically been turned into the most ridiculous damn looking kaiju. Saving Dr. Caliban for just a quick cameo is it's just a throwaway joke, and it's also kind of like, it's sort of a reference to, like the 1 second cameos in Destroy All Monsters or Godzilla Final Wars where some kaiju barely got to appear. I'm thinking of Baragon and Varan in Destroy All Monsters or Hedorah in Godzilla Final Wars. Just one last monster to throw into the Easter basket, so why the hell not? Soon we see all the others under attack. Hypnasia, that's a pretty good pose on Hypnasia. Tigadactyl knocked out of the air, and Babarus giving a yoink! Too late, the Pleasurelian wish has been granted, and our kaiju have been turned back into human wimps. And they're naked. I don't think anyone has ever wanted to see Dr. Caliban naked. It's using this here with the nasty hairy butt showing is one more EC Mad homage. Probably my very favorite EC Mad story is the Melvin Mole one. And Melvin Mole was probably a pretty good inspiration for Dr. Caliban's design in the first place. The Melvin Mole story has a segment where he gets thrown in jail with all of his clothes taken off, and of course you get to see his hairy butt stubble, which is revoltingly hilarious, so I just swiped it here. Zarbanak, of course, is not happy. He's going to take it out on the nearest target, which just so happens to be a little three-toed sloth. What's going to happen to him? Well, it's another deleted scene, and from here on in, there's going to be a lot of those. I never write a story with the ending in mind, because it's something I feel like I have to discover along the way. And that comes in handy for comedy or just zany madcap stories like that. I know a lot of writers who do write their ending first and work backwards. That comes in handy for stuff like mysteries or long-running soaps or whatnot. But for comedy, I think spontaneity and fluidity is pretty important. So now the downside of that is that you come up with a lot of stuff that does not stick. You just have to You just have to throw it out there, see if you like it, and if it doesn't work, you gotta scrap it. So let's see the first of our sketch endings. Zarbanok has cornered Sloth Scapula. What's gonna happen to him? Well, it looks like the behemoth has shown up out of nowhere. Apparently, in this version, the behemoth has some sort of artificial intelligence and has tracked down Scapula like a dog looking for its owner. And it's gonna save Scapula by eating Zarbanok. We had Scapula crawling to the UFO. 15 minutes of crawling later, he hits that remote, and it turns out that's the reason why, I guess, Zarbanok had a garage door opener remote for a reason, is so Scapula could get access to the transmutron, whatever it was called. And he's now back in control of the behemoth. They stroll along the street, they pick up the sinister monsters, and as their rampage continues, the pleasure alien faces them down, and that's when I realized this idea sucks. But there were a lot of ideas that just didn't work. There was the very, very, very first idea was that they rode the behemoth into the ocean and then they realized the thing doesn't swim, and which would have been really, really friggin' stupid. Brainstorm, come up with stuff, sketch things out, and of course don't go with an idea that you think isn't gonna work, but sketch it out anyway, because you can work with it. Zarbanok faces Scapula. What's he gonna do? Well, Scapula is gonna fight back, and it turns out he can fight back a lot harder when he's not human. One of the first storyboards I ever made for an animation was for a personal project, which was just about a sloth that drinks way too much coffee and becomes a murderous, hyperactive monster. So this was my way of kind of keeping that old memory alive by just out of nowhere showing that Scapula is capable not only of moving fast, but moving viciously and just slashing Zarbanok into pieces. The 0010 beep. And that's the end of Zarbanok. Timing in comics can be very, very tricky, and we're followed here by a segment that's really supposed to show that it's taking Scapula a long damn time to get to the UFO. Never mind the fact that he moves super fast when he was in kill mode, now he's just back into regular sloth mode and dragging along on his belly. You have to use the sound effects. And I'm looking at them now, and I think those could have been stretched out even further. I'm thinking like SH and maybe like 4 or 5 Fs that come after it. You get the idea. Conversely, when he gets to that garage door opener, now the sound effects are supposed to be moving faster. That's like when idiots go in an elevator and they want to go into their floor as soon as possible, so they're just like clicking the same damn button again and again. It's like, come on, don't do that, idiots. The comic book, yes. So Scapula just presses the button 10 million times, and miraculously, it seems to work. The transmutron is activated, and we have our sinister monsters. How they survived that fall, they landed in an alleyway that just so happened to be getting rid of hundreds and hundreds of mattresses, and they bounced off of them, and they were fine. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but doesn't also make a lot of sense thinking about what Toxic is saying here. I shouldn't have eaten that train. Don't think too much about it, about how he had eaten a train as a kaiju and now he's back to normal without a stomach full of train bits or whatnot. Let's just assume his intense pollution body digested it all and he's totally fine. Throger, of course, asks Hypnasia why he's standing around naked, even though they found rags and clothes in the alley. Hypnasia's answer is just being Hypnasia. We have another crowd full of, just random characters here, just trying to make it interesting as possible. Random woman speaking very eloquently, I don't know why. Shock and alarm, look what looms over yon horizon! And you see that punky kid with the ice cream cone from that deleted scene I had considered? Well, his wish was wasted because that ice cream has hit the sidewalk. Moving down to the street level, the winged kaiju form is starting to crawl out. I guess that's kind of an homage to Chernobog from Fantasia, Night on Bald Mountain, which is pretty awesome. More random people in the crowd, including a rather large rear-ended punk woman who some webcomic readers had thought was Knuckle Sam, and sadly, no it's not. Knuckle Sam had died about 3 years prior to this story. We follow that up with our big reveal of Kaiju Scapula. Now, showing Scapula looking cool or badass is something I never really wanted to do because I felt that went against the character, it went against the tone of the series as a whole. Back in the 90s, back in the Image days, there were a lot of comic creators who made their characters like super badass and whatnot because, all tough guys and guns and belt and bullet buckles and stuff like that, because I think a lot of them thought that the size of their dicks were measured by how much of a badass their character was, and I've always thought that was stupid. Scapula, conversely, was always meant to be, Even in his better moments, he's not meant to be an ass kicker. In this case, it was just have your cake and eat it too. Let's do Scapula as a kaiju, because it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I don't know how... I did not foresee any future stories where the characters just turn into giant monsters again, so let's just have a little fun and present a monster Scapula. And here's the big reveal on the next page.
I am reborn!
Wings flapping out. A lot of that skeleton design there. I guess the closest thing I can compare that to, kaiju-wise, there is an Ultraman monster named Sibozu, who is a dead sort of dinosaur thing who is just bones and black muscle mass and tendons just kind of holding it together. But that was also a logical conclusion with the Scapula design. The wings, of course, just kind of play in with the devil theme that's already established by the horns. Crowd of gawkers at the bottom looking upward, what's gonna happen? And of course, Scapula, his big demonic evil demands is he wants to know what happened to the girl in high school he asked out. One of the very, very earliest Scapula stories, which I had used to pitch to comic publishers who weren't interested, was about Scapula pulling a heist and randomly running into his high school crush. And of course, a paranoid mind like his immediately goes into a fritz. Jane Lewinsky was the name of that girl, and it looks like poor Scapula, and with his obsessive mind, still can't get over certain things. Now let's go to another deleted section. Like I said, there is quite a few of these because I just did not know how to end this damn thing appropriately. Scapula continues his rant, the Pleasureline Queen floats up in the air and suddenly pulls out a big boxing glove, knocks him out, floats down to the street and reveals that she had fulfilled the pleasure of, I guess, a grouchy old nun who just wanted Scapula gone. That climax would have sucked, even if it was supposedly a comedic anticlimax. No, that would have sucked, so let's forget that ever happened. And let's go on to the third one, because if the last one sucked, this one is just stupid. Now, Scapula's continuing his rant. This time, it's not just the Pleasureline Queen, it's all 5 Pleasurealians who fly on up. They say a little old lady says that their pleasure would be to stop the demon. They once again summon anime forms, but this time they combine Voltron style into something called Happytron. Happytron, I guess, it sort of looks like a cross between a teddy bear, a cat, a unicorn, with lots of rainbows coming out of it, and this is the stupidest thing ever. And not like good stupid, not funny stupid. Now, I like nonsense. I love nonsensical humor. I love Dada. I love Python, and stuff like that. When you're really defying expectations, the results can often be really hilarious. A lot of times, though, people go for the LOL school of random humor, and more often than not, it feels like they're just doing that because they couldn't think of anything clever or because they're just kind of desperate. And, you know, I've desperately thrown out jokes there that don't work, but this would not have worked in the least. Scapula was going to fight the thing. It shoots a rainbow of WOV. It actually would have said WOV. Scapula can't stand the rainbow, so he responds with a hellfire of hate. The two of them, the two blasts cancel each other out. The Happytron charges towards Scapula, gives him a great big hug. Scapula can't stand the power of niceness. No! Hey, this is nice. And then kablooey, just big explosion. But not any old explosion. It's a pink, sugary, rainbowy explosion because we can see the crowd below. It's raining candy hearts on them. Scapula falls to the ground. He's human again, God knows how. He's not in a very good mood. He's pretty burnt up. Someone get me some pants, booze, and a lot of Bactine. The Pleasurealians come back down to him. I guess the Pleasurealian Queen doesn't recognize him because she says, "Oh, another Earthman. What is your pleasure?" Scapula has ideas. He says, "What would give me pleasure? I wish you were dead!" The Pleasurealian Queen obliges. She says, "Well, so be it." The Pleasurealians all start charging up a lot of energy, engage self-destruct, big explosion, smash cut ending. And that would have been it. Well, I don't need to tell you that it doesn't work. There's a time and a place for random stuff like that, but, you know, it can work in something like Ghostbusters when a big marshmallow man just comes out of nowhere because nobody was expecting that. But in this case, this would have sucked so hard. So like with every other deleted scene, let's put it to the side, pretend it didn't happen, and get back to our story at hand. Rewind. Back to Scapula. giving a big, continuing his big rant, I guess for the fourth time in this video, when all of a sudden he is bitten from behind by the behemoth. This is a worm's eye view that actually does kind of work. I didn't attempt too many of these street level shots looking up at the kaiju, because that kind of perspective can be kind of weird, especially with characters, because if you're not careful, they just look like they have giant feet, giant guts, and tiny little heads. Thankfully here it works. It actually works all right. I think it turned out pretty well. I don't know if the 3-point perspective is accurate or not, but whatever. It is what it's what it's supposed to be. It's Scapula being attacked by the behemoth. Why is the behemoth attacking him? Because, surprise, surprise, the Area 51 scientists were behind it. This is the guy who got punched out earlier. I still hate that character design. If I ever do re-release this book, I am gonna redraw that guy. And what would he look like? Let's just say he'll look like the Patreon backer who's contributed the most over the years. And we get to another very obtuse joke, and this one I'm not really sure if it works or not. We have just a crowd of random people, as many American stereotypes as I can think of, chanting USA, USA, kind of like the old Jerry Springer show or whatnot. Whether or not this is praising America or ridiculing America, that's up to you. I guess why they're there, I needed the good guys or whatnot to oppose the protagonist and show that people, just a reminder that Scapula's still the villain. He's on the bad side, but not that this comic has ever looked too highly on the forces of good either. Does it work? I'm not really sure, but one of the things I am thinking of here is if these were supposed to be American stereotypes, the one thing that every single one of them needed was to be brandishing a gun. The only thing Americans want more than liberty, justice, or democracy is our goddamn firearms. Sorry to preach, but it's true. And now, kaiju fight. Scapula unleashes his Hellfire Beam, conveniently calling out Hellfire Beam. I think I was going to have him breathe fire, but then I decided to save that ability for the Behemoth, because I think that was established in Behemoth's first appearance that it had a giant flamethrower in its mouth. We have them crashing through the streets. Now, so far, even though this has been an attack on San Francisco, there haven't been a lot of landmarks of the city. I realized afterwards that I could have done something. Again, referring back to Destroy All Monsters or Godzilla Final Wars, where each kaiju was in a very specific location, I could have actually sent the kaiju to the random neighborhoods of San Francisco, a lot of which are very, very different from each other. This is really the only specific landmark that I did, well, aside from briefly showing the Golden Gate Bridge earlier, and this is the Embarcadero Ferry building that Scapula is crashing into. They've just gone down Market Street, I guess, and they're smashing into it, taking out the clock tower, and crushing right through the building. This fight was originally going to go on for 2 pages, but then I realized that fight scenes don't really do a hell of a lot for me. From a storytelling point of view, they're really only interesting as far as what's at stake or what the characters are doing, but since this is basically just 2 kaiju going at it, rather than just go on and on forever with it, just keep it to 1 page and make it as well illustrated of a fight scene as I could do in 5 panels. So they go crashing into the ocean, and a lot of kaiju fans will know that that back in the 60s, this was a very common way to end Godzilla movies or whatnot, is that Godzilla or his opponent would go falling into the ocean, and that was a convenient way to just end it. Because out of sight, out of mind. They fall into the ocean, it looks like everything's fine, except for 2 big things like that. Hitting the waves is, of course, going to cause a big tidal wave. We have a lot of random characters in here, random gags, guy checking out someone's butt while they're drowning. The dolphin about to collide with somebody is really stupid. I like that, actually. And some dude who dropped his phone. And knowing a lot of people that are addicted to their phones, I can believe that's the very first thing someone would be concerned about. The aftermath of that tidal wave is that a lot of the city is soaked while the rest of it's burning. But you know what? Mr. Soldier Guy says, "We saved the city!" It's an empty victory. It's kind of like that Gahan Wilson cartoon, "I think I won!" in the middle of a battlefield. Being picked up from the battlefield are the Sinister monsters. They're escorted off to jail, but anybody who reads comics know that jail time for supervillains doesn't really last. These guys have been in and out of jail in this comic, and how they get out every single time is, I guess, the same way any supervillain gets out of jail. The needs of the writer. We have our lineup here. You guys see on the far right, there's Tigadactyl without his costume. He was only shown without his costume twice in the entire series, mostly because he was so much into the Tigadactyl persona. Well, of course, except for a throwaway joke where we revealed that he was actually Rick Baker, but that was that was retconned out. Zarbonok's remains were picked up by a basement-dwelling conspiracy theorist who I wanted to especially show that he had a neckbeard, because neckbeards are revolting. I probably could have filled up that background with more paraphernalia or whatnot, just really cluttered up the place, but oh well, too late now. But the most important thing is that the dachshund was fine. He got scratches, he's doing okay. And we see Scapula in a typically humorous, messed up ending for him, has been left adrift on top of the behemoth. If you look really, really closely on his arm, you can see that he still has the serpentine dragon tattoo that he had got at the end of the Memento Mori story, but he's so far away that it just looks like a little scribble. I don't know if anybody saw that as a mistake or not. And the Pleasuralians, oh, they can fly by the way, are swooping right in to continue their mission of giving pleasure, this time to a sea lion. And San Francisco residents will know that, they have sea lions all over the place, usually hanging it up Pier 39, shoving each other around. Bark, bark. And at long last, that's the end. And that's our show. Thank you very much for watching. Please check out the YouTube archives for more monstrous videos. Join us in on Patreon, Scapula Comics, if you want to help support me. And finally, grab a book if that's your fancy. See you next time, guys. Bye-bye.